She was standing on a dirt floor, staring at a man whose boots were held together with twine. Lillian Hart thought she had just traded one nightmare for another. She escaped crushing debt in Boston only to end up in a rotting shack in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. She was ready to scream. She was ready to run. But here is what Lillian did not know. The rough hands pouring her coffee. They signed checks that could buy the entire state. The poor farmer she married. He was sitting on a secret that powerful men had killed for. And that miserable dirt house she despised? It was the only fortress standing between her and a war that was about to set the whole West on fire. This is the story of a mail-order bride who thought she had settled for nothing, only to discover she had married the hidden king of the frontier. But when the most dangerous man in the territory comes to take everything, Lillian must become something she never imagined. A warrior. Will she survive? Or will she lose everything before she even knows what she has? This story reminds us that our greatest strength often reveals itself in our darkest moments. Sometimes the life we think we are settling for is actually the destiny we were meant to fight for. If you love stories of strong women, sweet revenge, and unexpected love, you are in the right place. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever discovered something was far more valuable than it first appeared? Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story. And share this with someone who needs a little hope today. Now let us begin. The rain back in Boston never washed anything clean. It just made all the filth a little more slippery. Lillian Hart pulled the collar of her worn-out coat up tight, keeping her eyes on the slick cobblestones of Wharf Street as she hurried along. The year was 1875, and a financial panic had the entire city struggling to breathe. For Lillian, though, the feeling of being smothered was deeply personal. She held onto the letter in her pocket like it was some kind of shield. It was the one and only thing keeping Mr. Tobias Crowley at bay. Now, Crowley was not a banker. Bankers keep business hours and follow the rules. Crowley was more like a dark shadow that hung over her father's old tailor shop. He was the kind of man who would collect on a debt with a smile that never once touched his cold gray eyes. Her father had passed on 3 months back. His heart gave out from the pressure of owing Crowley $2,000, a fortune that Lillian, who earned just pennies for her sewing, had no chance of ever paying back. She rounded a corner and stopped dead in her tracks. There, right in front of the boarding house where she had a small room, stood one of Crowley's men, a tough character named O'Malley. He was just leaning up against a gas lamp, cleaning his teeth with a wood sliver. Lillian did not think twice. She turned right around, her heart pounding in her chest like a wild thing in a cage, and slipped into an alley that led to the post office. There was no going back. Not for her clothes, and not even for her mother's precious locket. She took the folded newspaper clipping out of her pocket and read it for the 100th time in the faint light of the alley. Wanted. A wife. Must be strong and of good character. The life here is difficult. The loneliness is complete. I can give you a roof over your head and keep you safe. I have no luxuries to offer. Write to Jeremiah Holt, Blackwater Ridge, Wyoming Territory. It was the most grim and cheerless proposal she had ever laid eyes on. It made no promises of love, and it did not mention a kind soul or a comfortable home. It only promised hard work and a place to live. But that one word, protection, was what had caught her attention. Lillian used the very last of her money for a telegraph message and a train ticket. Their letters back and forth had been short. Jeremiah Holt was clearly not a man who wasted words. He sent the money for a third-class ticket on the Union Pacific, along with 2 simple rules. Come by yourself, and tell nobody. When she got to the station, the steam and smoke from the engines washed over her. It smelled like freedom. She got on the train, finding a spot between a Swedish family and a fellow who smelled of old tobacco, and she took one last look at the Boston skyline. She was 24 years old, had a good education, and had once dreamed of having her very own dress shop on Newbury Street. Now she was basically selling herself to a man she had never met out in the middle of nowhere, all to keep from getting hurt. The trip out west was just a long smear of different scenery passing by the window. The crowded brick buildings of the east slowly turned into the green, rolling hills of the Midwest, and then finally into the huge, frightening emptiness of the plains. When the train finally shrieked to a stop in Cheyenne, Lillian felt like a completely different person. Her dress was dirty with soot from the engine. She was bone-tired, with dark circles around her eyes. She got off the train onto the wooden platform, and the wind immediately whipped her hair all around her face. It was late in October, and the air had a real bite to it. Lillian Hart. The voice that called her name was low and rough, like the sound of big rocks scraping against each other at the bottom of a river. She turned around. The man she saw was downright intimidating. He was a tall man, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the afternoon light. He had on a long duster coat that might have been tan a long time ago, but was now covered in grease and mud. He wore his hat pulled down low, hiding his eyes in shadow and making them impossible to read. A thick, messy black beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his boots that really got her attention. The leather was cracked and peeling, the bottoms looked worn through, and his left boot was tied together with a piece of twine to keep the sole on. This had to be Jeremiah Holt. Lillian felt her stomach sink like a stone. She knew he would be poor. The letter had told her as much. But this man looked like he had absolutely nothing. He looked like he had been beaten down by the land itself and was just waiting for the end. "Mr. Holt?" she asked, and she could hear her own voice shaking. He did not smile. He did not stick out his hand to shake hers. He just gave one single, sharp nod. I have one bag," she told him, pointing down at the worn-out suitcase by her feet. He picked it up like it was filled with feathers. "Wagon is this way." She followed him through the loud and busy streets of Cheyenne. They walked past saloons where you could hear piano music pouring out, past cattlemen yelling back and forth making deals, and past ladies in fine silk dresses laughing up on the balconies. Lillian felt herself getting smaller and smaller with every step. It seemed like everybody else belonged there. Jeremiah walked her right past all the fancy carriages and the big solid freight wagons, all the way to the far side of the lot. And there sat a buckboard wagon that looked like it had been through a battle. Wood was all weathered gray and splintered. The horse hitched up to it was a huge, scarred roan that looked even tougher than the man who owned it. Jeremiah threw her bag in the back without a word. He climbed onto the seat, which groaned under his size, and then he looked down at her. "Are you coming?" Lillian glanced back at the town. She could stay, maybe try to find a job as a maid or a laundress, but she knew Crowley had long arms, and she did not have a single dollar for a place to stay. She clenched her jaw, gathered her skirts, and pulled herself up onto the hard wooden seat next to him. "Let us go," she whispered. Jeremiah snapped the reins. For the first 4 hours, neither of them said a word. The Wyoming landscape had a kind of beauty that was almost painful to look at. It was so big, so empty, and it did not seem to care about her at all. They kept riding until the sun started to sink low, smearing the sky with angry colors of deep purple and fiery orange. The quiet between them felt thick and heavy. Lillian tried to watch him out of the corner of her eye. His hands were calloused, and his knuckles were covered in old scars. He handled the horse with a natural skill, but he sat up straight and watchful. He was always looking out at the horizon, always scanning, his eyes moving from the high ridges to the low valleys. "Is it much farther?" Lillian finally managed to ask, her throat feeling parched. "About another hour," Jeremiah answered. His voice was a surprise. It was clear and well-spoken, not at all like the rough country accent she had heard from the men back in Cheyenne. It was just a plain, level kind of speech. "You wrote that you could offer a roof," Lillian said, trying her best to make conversation. "Do you raise cattle or do you plant crops?" Jeremiah made a short, sharp sound. It might have been a chuckle. "The land up at Blackwater Ridge will not grow any crops, Miss Hart." It is too rocky, and there is not nearly enough good grass to feed a herd of cattle. Lillian's brow furrowed. Well, then, how do you make a living? He turned to look at her for just a second. Under the brim of his hat, his eyes were a shocking, piercing blue. They were smart, sharp, and closed off. I manage, was all he said. I do some hunting, a little bit of trading. Lillian felt her last bit of hope drain away. A man who lives off the land. She had married a man with nothing. The sun was completely gone when they finally turned off the main path and onto a skinny, rock-strewn trail that climbed up into the hills. The air turned cold fast. Lillian started to shiver, pulling her thin coat tighter around herself. Without saying anything, Jeremiah reached behind him and grabbed a heavy wool blanket. He tossed it right into her lap. It smelled like a campfire and horses, but it was wonderfully thick and warm. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not answer. They reached the top of a small hill, and the moonlight lit up a little valley below. It was like a bowl with steep, rocky cliffs on 3 of its sides, and right in the middle of it was his homestead. Lillian had to stop herself from gasping out loud. It was a sod house, built right into the side of a hill, with a front wall made from logs and packed dirt. It looked more like a den for some animal than a place for a person to live. Next to it was a little lean-to barn that looked like it might fall over at any second. A single lantern was hanging by the door, swaying back and forth in the wind. "This is home," Jeremiah said as he brought the wagon to a stop. Lillian just sat there, unable to move. Back in Boston, the worst slums were made of brick. This was just earth. She was going to be living in a house made of dirt. Jeremiah jumped down from the wagon and came around to her side. For the very first time, he was gentle with her. He put his hands on her waist to help her down, and his touch was strong but proper. "It is not much," he said, his voice a little softer now, "but it is safe." Nobody ever comes up this way, she thought to herself, because nobody would ever want to. She went up to the door. It was made of thick, heavy oak, which seemed strange for such a poor-looking place, and it was locked with a huge iron bolt. Jeremiah turned the key and led her inside. The whole place was just one single room. A cast-iron stove was in one corner, giving off the last of its warmth. There was a roughly made table with 2 chairs, and a bed in the back corner that was piled high with animal furs. The floor was just hard-packed dirt, but it had been swept clean. The place was miserable. "I will see to the horse," Jeremiah said. "There is stew on the stove. You should eat." And with that, he was gone. Lillian stood right there in the middle of the room, trying hard not to cry from pure exhaustion. "So this is my life," she thought. "I am now Mrs. Jeremiah Holt, the lady of a house made of mud." She walked over to the stove and took the lid off the pot. The scent of deer meat and herbs rose up to meet her. It actually smelled just heavenly. Her stomach rumbled, betraying her. She located a tin bowl and spoon and helped herself to a serving. While she ate, her gaze drifted around the small room. It was simple for sure, but the closer she looked, the more things felt off-kilter. The table she was at was just rough-hewn pine, but the chair she sat on was genuine mahogany. It was old with plenty of scratches, but the fine work was plain as day. It was the sort of elegant piece she'd only seen in the fancy homes on Beacon Hill. Her eyes fell on the shelf over the bed. It held books, and not just a family Bible, but volumes bound in real leather. She got to her feet and went over, tracing the spines with her fingers. The Wealth of Nations, by a man named Adam Smith. Principles of Geology, by Lyell. Meditations, by Marcus Aurelius. She took down a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. The book fell open to a page someone had marked. Down in the margins, notes were scribbled in a sharp, slanted handwriting. The ink was rich and dark, not the cheap kind that fades to gray. "You have a liking for books?" Lillian nearly jumped out of her skin, almost fumbling the volume. Jeremiah was right there in the doorway. He had shed his hat and long coat. With the shadows gone, she saw he was younger than she had figured, maybe 32. He was handsome, but not in a townfolk way. He was rugged and had a dangerous air about him. though his face was etched with weariness. Yes, Lillian managed to say. I just never figured on finding a library out here. Jeremiah moved to the stove and poured coffee for himself from a tin pot. Books are light baggage, and they don't ask for supper. He settled against the wall, sipping his coffee and just watching her. You are disappointed. It was not a question. Lillian felt her back straighten. I am surprised, Mr. Holt. You live so plainly, yet you spend your time reading philosophy and sitting on a mahogany chair. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed just a little. Just some wreckage from another life. Do not read anything into it. And the lock on that door, Lillian pushed on, her frustration overriding her fear. That is a fortress bolt on a sod house. Who are you so scared of, Jeremiah? Or maybe I should be asking, who is scared of you? Jeremiah placed his cup on the table. The tin made a sharp clank in the quiet room. He walked toward her, stopping only a few feet from her. The very air in the cabin seemed to grow heavy. There are wolves out in these hills, Lillian, he said, his voice low. And there are things a whole lot worse than wolves. You wanted to be safe from your troubles back in Boston. I am giving you that safety. But the cost is you do not ask about what is past. Is that a deal we can live with? Lillian had to look up to meet his gaze. She could see the danger clear as day. Yes. But she saw something else too. A deep and tired sadness. And just beneath the collar of his dusty shirt, she finally noticed what she had missed. A ring was hanging from a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt. The gold flashed in the light from the lantern. It was a heavy, thick piece of gold. A cord, she said in a whisper. Good, he replied. You take the bed. I will sleep out in the barn tonight. You do not have to do that. I do, he stated with finality. I did not bring you all the way out here to cause you shame. We will get married right and proper when the circuit preacher makes his way through next week. Until that time, the bed is yours. He started to leave, picking up his rifle from its spot by the door. Jeremiah. He stopped, his hand on the door latch. Who is Mr. Sterling? She asked. Jeremiah went completely still. His knuckles grew white from gripping the rifle. He turned around ever so slowly. Where did you hear that name? I saw it, she answered, motioning toward the Shakespeare book. On the inside of the cover, property of C. Sterling. Jeremiah's face became cold, like it was carved from stone. Mr. Sterling is the man who owns all this territory, Jeremiah said, his voice lowering to a dangerous rumble. He is the man who thinks he is God Almighty. And if he ever finds out you are here, may the Lord have mercy on us both. He slammed the door shut behind him. Lillian was left standing in the sudden silence, with only the sound of the wind howling outside. She looked from the book to the heavy iron bolt on the door. She was not just some poor farmer's new wife. She was a single playing card in a high-stakes game she did not even know the rules to. And as she lay down on the furs, listening to that lonely wind, she understood that Jeremiah Holt was not hiding from being poor. He was lying in wait. But for what? The first morning light did not wake Lillian gently. It busted right into the sod house. The sun cleared the eastern ridge and sent sharp fingers of light through the cracks around the wooden door, lighting up the tiny dust motes that were dancing in the chilly air. Lillian woke with a jolt, her whole body aching from the strange mattress. For a heartbeat, she thought she was back in Boston, and the heavy feeling in her chest was just the old, familiar dread of what she owed. But then she smelled the earth, that rich, dry scent of the packed ground, and it all came back to her. She pushed herself up. The room was empty. The heavy iron bolt on the inside of the door was pulled back. Jeremiah was already gone. Lillian got up, pulling the wool blanket tight around her shoulders like a shawl. The fire inside the stove had burned down to nothing but glowing embers. She carefully added a few small pieces of wood from the nearby pile, watching the flames catch before she turned to look over her new home in the light of day. It was cleaner than it had seemed last night, but there was no denying it was poor. The floor was just hard-packed dirt. The walls had been lined with old newspapers to stop the dirt from crumbling, a common trick she knew settlers used. But seeing the headlines from 1872 only made her feel more like she was stuck in another time. She found a note left on the table, held down by a heavy brass compass. "Gone to check the fences. Do not leave the valley. Water is in the barrel outside. J." "Check the fences," Lillian whispered to herself, "like a soldier." She quickly put on her plainest dress, a gray calico that had seen better times, and stepped out the door. The morning air was sharp and clean, smelling of sagebrush and pine. The view, she had to give him this, was breathtaking. The valley was like a golden bowl filled with tall grass, protected on all sides by granite cliffs that shot up like jagged teeth. But her gaze was pulled toward the barn. It was about 50 yards from the house, leaning dangerously to one side. Its roof was a patchwork of rusted tin and chunks of sod. It looked like one good gust of wind could knock it flat. If Jeremiah was truly a farmer, his tools would be inside. If he was a hunter, that is where he would be curing his hides. She had to know what kind of life she had just agreed to. She had to know if they were going to starve when winter came. She crossed the yard, the soles of her boots making a crunching sound on the frost-covered grass. The big barn door was barely hanging on by a single hinge, held shut with just a simple loop of rope. "Hello?" she called out, her voice soft. "Mr. Holt." Only silence answered. She slipped the rope off and squeezed herself through the opening. The inside of the barn was dark, lit only by the thin beams of light that cut through the cracks in the rotting walls. At first it looked like exactly what she had expected, just a pile of old junk. There was a rusted plow, some broken harnesses, and a big mound of moldy hay over in the corner. But Lillian was a seamstress. Her whole life had been about paying attention to the little things. A single missed stitch, a button that did not quite match, a hem that was not perfectly straight. And something about this barn was not straight at all. The whole layout was stitched together wrong. From the outside, the barn looked to be about 30 feet deep, but the back wall, which was just a neat stack of hay bales, was only 20 feet in. 10 feet of space was just gone. Curiosity fought a war with her fear. Do not ask questions about the past, he had warned her. But this was not the past. This was where she lived now. She walked to that back wall. The hay bales were stacked up perfectly, almost too perfectly. She gave one a pull. It was heavy, but it moved. And behind it there was not a wooden wall, but a dark, oil-stained canvas tarp. Lillian's heart started to pound hard against her ribs. She glanced back over her shoulder at the open barn door. The yard was still empty. She pulled the canvas sheet aside, and there was a door. It was not a barn door, it was a heavy, steel-reinforced door, the kind she had seen on the bank vaults back in Boston. It had been painted black so it would blend in with the shadows, but the heavy iron wheel right in the center was a dead giveaway. "What in the world?" she whispered to herself. She walked over and gave the wheel a spin. It was locked up tighter than a drum. She took a step back, her thoughts racing. A bank vault door inside a rundown barn, smack in the middle of the Wyoming territory. Why? What could he possibly be keeping in there? Gold, stolen cash. Was Jeremiah Hole a bank robber laying low? That would certainly explain why he lived so far from anyone. It would explain why he was so jumpy. She glanced down at the floor by the massive door. The dirt ground in this spot looked different. It was not hard-packed earth. It was wood planks covered with a fine layer of dust as a disguise. She used her foot to sweep the dirt aside. It was a trap door. This one was not locked. It had a simple iron ring for a handle. Lillian grabbed the ring with both of her hands and pulled with all her might. The trap door was heavy but balanced, and it swung upward with a quiet, well-oiled hiss of hydraulics that sounded completely foreign in this rustic old barn. Below, a ladder went down into pure darkness. But it was not complete darkness. A strange, faint chemical-like glow was coming from down below. Lillian took a deep breath gathered her skirts, and started to climb down. The air changed completely. It turned cool and dry, and it smelled of paper, oil, and something sharp like ozone. When she reached the bottom, she turned around, and she gasped. She was not in a root cellar. She was standing in an office, some kind of command center. The room was dug deep into the ground, with walls held up by brick and thick timbers. A few kerosene lamps burned with a low, steady amber light. In the middle of the room sat a huge drafting table covered with maps. These were not rough drawings, but professional survey maps of the entire territory. They were pinned down tight and covered all over with complicated mathematical notes. The walls were lined with shelves, but they held geological samples instead of food. They were just rocks with little white tags that read things like quartz, pyrite, and hematite. And over in the corner, on a heavy, solid desk, sat a telegraph machine. A wire snaked up from it, went across the wall, and vanished right through the ceiling. Lillian walked over to the drafting table. She laid her hand flat on the biggest map. It was a map of... Lillian's eyes traced over the map of Blackwater Ridge and the whole surrounding county. It was all laid out in colors. Nearly the entire thing was a sea of red, marked plain as day with the name C. Sterling. But a single blue line, thin as a thread, cut right through the heart of Sterling's red empire. That blue vein started right here at Jeremiah's homestead and snaked all the way down into the valley. Down at the bottom, a little key read, Blackwater Aquifer, Primary Access Point. And stamped right underneath that in bold red ink were the words, Deed Holder, Jeremiah Holt. Lillian just stared at it. She understood. She understood enough about this part of the country to know that water was worth a whole lot more than gold. If Jeremiah owned the main source of water, he was not some poor dirt farmer. He had a hold on the very throat of the entire valley. She moved over to the desk where a few ledgers were stacked. She picked one up and opened it. This was not a list of his debts. It was a list of offers. May 12th, 1874. Sterling offers $5,000. Declined. August 4th, 1874. Sterling offers $10,000. Declined. September 1874. Barn burned. A warning shot. October 15th, 1874. Offer, $50,000. Declined. $50,000. Lillian felt a jolt run through her. She had almost sold her entire future for $2,000. Jeremiah had turned his back on a fortune big enough to build a palace. I told you not to go asking questions. The voice came down from the top of the ladder. Lillian spun around, clutching the ledger to her chest like a shield. Jeremiah was standing at the top of the hatch, his dark shape blocking out the light. He held his rifle loosely in one hand. He did not look angry. He just looked resigned, like a man who had already accepted his fate. He climbed down the ladder slowly, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. He walked right past her, gently took the ledger from her hands and closed it. "You are not a farmer," Lillian whispered, her voice barely there. You are a millionaire." A bitter laugh escaped Jeremiah. "I am a man with a piece of paper that says I am rich, and a gun to my head that says I am dead if I ever try to cash it." He walked to the map. "I was a surveyor for the Union Pacific. I found the aquifer 5 years ago. I bought the deed fair and square before Sterling even knew it existed. He bought up all the land around me, thinking he could squeeze me out, thinking the water had to be on his property. When he finally found out the source was right here, well..." He looked at her, and his blue eyes were fierce. "Sterling controls this town. He controls the law. If I sell to him, he will dam that water and charge the farmers in this valley 10 times what it is worth. He will starve them out and take their land. I am the only thing stopping him from turning this whole territory into his own private kingdom." "So you live like a pauper," Lillian said, the whole awful picture finally coming into focus. "To hide," Jeremiah corrected her. "To survive. If I flash money around, I am painting a target on my back. If I leave, he just takes the land. So I stay." I sit on this rock, and I hold the line." He stepped closer to her. "I needed a wife, Lillian, because the Homestead Act says a married man can claim double the acreage if he files for an extension. It secures the southern ridge. It makes it that much harder for him to steal it legally." A chill went down Lillian's spine. "I am a legal maneuver." Jeremiah's expression softened just a little. He reached out his rough hand, letting it hover near her face for a moment before dropping it to his side. "You are a partner. I did not expect you to be so smart or so brave." He sighed. "Get your coat. We need supplies. And if we are going to survive this, you need to see the enemy for yourself. We are going to town." "Into town?" she asked. "Yes," Jeremiah said, and his eyes hardened like stone. "Right into the lion's den." The ride to town took a full 2 hours. The silence in the wagon was different now. It was not the awkward quiet of strangers. It was the heavy, charged silence of conspirators. Jeremiah had made her change clothes. He had her put on her oldest dress and even rubbed a little dust onto the hem himself. "We have to look beaten," he told her. "Sterling feeds on weakness. If he thinks we are proud, he strikes. If he thinks we are desperate, he will just wait for us to break." As they crested the final hill, the town of Blackwater Ridge sprawled out below them. It was surprisingly large for the territory. There were 2 main streets forming a cross. To the west, there were shanties, tents, and rough timber buildings for the miners and the transient workers. To the east, the buildings were brick and painted white. And dominating the center of town, sitting on a raised foundation like a throne, was the Sterling Hotel. It was 3 stories tall with a wraparound porch and glass windows that must have cost a fortune to ship from the east. "Stay close to me," Jeremiah murmured, as he guided the horses onto the main street. "Do not speak unless you are spoken to, and whatever you do, do not look Caleb Sterling in the eye." The town was busy with men on horseback and women with shopping baskets. There were wagons loaded down with timber, but as Jeremiah's battered wagon rolled through, the noise seemed to dip. Heads turned and people whispered. Lillian felt their eyes on them. They were not looking with curiosity. They were looking with pity and with fear. Jeremiah pulled the wagon up to the hitching post in front of Higgins' General Store. He hopped down and helped her out. "Head down," he reminded her. They entered the store. It smelled of coffee beans, leather, and sawdust. The shopkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Higgins, stiffened when she saw Jeremiah. "Mr. Holt," she said, her voice cool as ice. "We did not expect to see you until next month." "Ran low on flour," Jeremiah said, his voice taking on that rough, uneducated drawl he had used at the train station. He hunched his shoulders, making himself look smaller. "And I brought the wife." Mrs. Higgins looked at Lillian, her eyes raking over the dusty dress. "So I heard. Mail order, was it?" Lillian wanted to snap back, but she remembered Jeremiah's warning. She just stared at the floorboards. "Yes, ma'am." "Well," Mrs. Higgins sniffed, "I suppose you will need the basics. But your credit is thin, Mr. Holt, very thin." "I got cash," Jeremiah mumbled, patting his pocket as they moved through the aisles, picking out sacks of flour, beans, and coffee. Lillian felt a simmering rage. She knew Jeremiah could buy this entire store 5 times over with the gold she had seen samples of in the bunker, yet he had to beg for beans. The bell above the door chimed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The low hum of conversation stopped instantly. Lillian turned slowly. A man stood in the doorway. He was flanked by 2 other men, large gunslingers with low-slung holsters. But the man in the center drew all the attention. He was in his 50s, wearing a pristine gray suit that was impeccably tailored. He held a silver-tipped cane, though he walked without a limp. His hair was silver and swept back, and his face was handsome, smooth, and utterly predatory. This was Caleb Sterling. Sterling scanned the room like a cattle baron inspecting his herd. His gaze finally settled hard on Jeremiah. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. "Well now," Sterling drawled, his voice as smooth as expensive whiskey. If it ain't the hermit of the hills. He started walking toward them. The steady tap of his cane on the floor was the only thing you could hear in the whole place. Jeremiah didn't turn all the way around, he just kept his head hung low. "Mr. Sterling, I hear you went and found yourself a bride, Jeremiah," Sterling said, stopping just a few feet shy of them. He then turned to look at Lillian. His stare felt like a greasy hand crawling right up her arm. She was a city woman, you could tell just by looking, from Boston. Lillian held her tongue. She has got some fire, Sterling thought. Or the cat has got her tongue. Which one is it? She is shy, Jeremiah said in a rush, moving to stand a little bit in front of Lillian. We are just getting our supplies, Mr. Sterling. We do not want any trouble. Sterling let out a cold, barking laugh. Trouble? Son, you are the trouble. You are a stain on the good name of this valley. You are a tick on the... He stepped closer, invading Jeremiah's personal space. My offer still stands, 50,000. That is a lot of money for a man who wears boots held together with string. You could take your pretty little wife to San Francisco, buy her a silk dress instead of this. He gestured vaguely at Lillian's dusty clothes. Jeremiah's hands were clenched at his sides. Lillian saw the tendons straining. He wanted to kill this man. She could feel the violence radiating off him. But Jeremiah forced his hands open. I like my land, Mr. Sterling. It is home. It is a grave, Sterling hissed. And sooner or later, you are going to fall into it. Sterling turned his attention back to Lillian. He reached out, and before Jeremiah could stop him, lifted Lillian's chin with the tip of his gloved finger. You are a pretty thing, Sterling said softly. When you get tired of starving up there in the dirt, you come see me at the hotel. I have a suite with a bathtub and hot water. Jeremiah moved. It was a subtle shift, a tensing of his shoulders, but the two gunmen behind Sterling instantly dropped their hands to their pistols. Lillian saw it. She knew if Jeremiah fought, he died, right here in the flower aisle. She jerked her chin away from Sterling's finger. I prefer the dirt, she said. Her voice was clear, crisp, and undeniably from Boston. It is cleaner. The store went deathly silent. Mrs. Higgins gasped behind the counter. Sterling stared at her. For a second, his eyes flashed with genuine anger. Then he chuckled. Cleaner, he repeated. We will see how clean you feel when the snow comes, my dear. We will see. He tipped his hat mockingly to Jeremiah. Tick-tock, Jeremiah. The railroad is coming in the spring. I want that water rights deed before the first track is laid, or I will take it from your cold, dead hands. He spun on his heel and walked out, his henchman trailing behind him. Lillian let out a breath she did not know she was holding. Her knees felt weak. Jeremiah grabbed her arm. His grip was tight. Pay, he said to the counter. Now. He threw a coin onto the counter. It was not a few copper pennies. It was a single, heavy gold piece that spun with a flash of light before settling with a loud, defiant clink. Model. It was a solid gold eagle, a $20 coin. Mrs. Higgins's eyes flickered from the shiny piece of gold to the worn-out fabric of Jeremiah's coat. A suspicious look crossed her face. Go on and keep the change, Jeremiah said in a low voice. He snatched the sack of flour and guided Lillian out of the store in a hurry. You should have kept your mouth shut, Jeremiah hissed as he tossed the supplies into the back of the wagon. He put his hands on me, Lillian replied, her voice trembling. I wasn't about to let him treat me like some piece of property. He was trying to provoke me, Lillian. Jeremiah hoisted himself onto the driver's seat and pulled her up beside him. He was hoping I'd go for my gun. If I did, his men would shoot me down and call it self-defense. Then he could legally claim my land the very next day. That is his way of doing things. He cracked the reins, and the wagon jolted away from the town. He is nothing but a monster, Lillian declared. He is a man of business, Jeremiah corrected her grimly. And he is running out of time. The railroad is coming through. That is going to change the whole game. That is his final deadline. Jeremiah glanced at her, his face looking pale. And now he is aware of you. He knows you are not just some simple farm girl. He has seen that spark in you. That makes you a danger. So what are we going to do? Lillian asked. Jeremiah stared at the horizon, where dark storm clouds were forming over the mountains. We are done running, he said. If he is looking for a fight, then we will give him one. But we cannot handle this by ourselves. We are going to need some help. From who? Lillian questioned. Everyone in that town is scared to death of him. Not everyone, Jeremiah replied. I know a man, an old acquaintance. He operates the freight company out of Laram. His name is Silas. No, not Silas, he corrected himself. He goes by Dutch Van Doren. He despises Sterling just about as much as I do, and if he refuses to help... Jeremiah reached under the seat and retrieved a heavy object wrapped in canvas. He carefully unwrapped it, revealing a gleaming lever-action Winchester rifle. He passed it to her. Then you had better figure out how to use this. The first snow of the year did not gently float down onto Blackwater Ridge. It came on with the raw fury of a bare-knuckle brawl. The wind screamed through the canyons, tearing the last of the autumn leaves from the cottonwood trees and covering the valley in a blanket of blinding white. Inside their sod house, the mood was heavy. For 3 straight days, Jeremiah had been training Lillian. It was not the gentle getting to know you of a new marriage. It was the harsh training of a soldier. Do it again, Jeremiah ordered, standing in the frigid wind just behind the house. Lillian brought the Winchester to her shoulder. The spot was bruised a dark shade of purple from the kickback, throbbing with every beat of her heart. Her fingers felt like ice inside her gloves, but she made no complaint. She took aim at the empty tin can sitting on a fence post 50 yards out. Breathe in, breathe out. Squeeze the trigger. Crack. The can flipped into the air, a clean hole punched right through its middle. Good enough, Jeremiah grunted. He offered no praise, only a simple confirmation. Now, reload. Do it while you are walking backward. Keep your eyes up. Lillian's hands fumbled with the lever, shaking from the cold and nerves. Do you honestly believe he will show up this soon in weather like this? Jeremiah gazed at the ridgeline, his eyes squinting against the bright reflection off the snow. Sterling is a prideful man, but he is not a fool. He knows this snow traps us here. He knows nobody can make it up that old trail from town without a struggle. If he is going to make his move, he will do it before the snow gets too high for his horses. He will want to make it appear as an accident, a house fire in the middle of winter, a real tragedy. He took the rifle from her, his fingers lightly brushing against hers. For just a second, the heavy tension between them seemed to lift. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the deep weariness in her eyes and the firm set of her jaw. I am truly sorry, he said in a quiet voice. This is not the kind of life you were promised. Lillian rubbed her aching shoulder. Your letter mentioned hard work and no comforts. You were not lying, Jeremiah. You just left out the part about the war. I have money, Jeremiah said without warning. Down in the bunker there is a safe hidden behind the map rack. There is enough gold in that safe to get you all the way to Paris. If things go bad, you take the tunnel. It opens up about a quarter-mile down the creek bed. You take the gold, you take the horse, and you do not turn back. Lillian's posture became rigid. I ran from a debt I owed back in Boston. Jeremiah, I am not running this time. Jeremiah looked like he wanted to argue, but the loud crack of a twig breaking outside made them both freeze up. That was not an animal. It sounded way too heavy. Inside, Jeremiah whispered. Now. They scrambled without another word, throwing the heavy bar across the oak door. Jeremiah pinched out the lantern's flame, and the room fell into a deep shadow, with only the red embers of the stove for light. He crept to the window shutter, peeking through a tiny crack. How many are there? Lillian breathed, clutching that Winchester rifle. 5, Jeremiah whispered back. Riders. They came up through the creek to keep things quiet. He turned to face her. They are not here to have a conversation. Go to the trap door. Get yourself in the bunker. Lock it from the inside. No, Lillian said. She pulled back the lever of her rifle, making a loud clicking sound. I am staying right here. Just then, a bottle flew through the window, smashing on the far wall. Right away, the whole cabin filled with the smell of kerosene. A moment later, a burning piece of cloth landed in the puddle. A great whoosh filled the air. Flames exploded upward, eating the old newspapers pasted on the walls. Fire! Jeremiah shouted. He grabbed a thick wool blanket and began to swing it at the flames, but the oil had already soaked into the dry dirt floor and the paper. The smoke was quickly becoming thick, burning their throats and eyes. Come on out, Holt, a voice yelled from outside. It was not Sterling's cultured voice. It was the coarse shout of a drunk. Come on out, or you're going to burn. Bullets started ripping through the front of the wooden house. Sharp splinters of wood flew through the air around them. We cannot stay in here, Jeremiah coughed, the smoke stinging his eyes. The roof is going to come down on us. The bunker, Lillian yelled over the noise. There is no time. If we open that trapdoor right now, they will spot it when they bust in. They will discover the entire command center. We have to lead them away from it. Jeremiah grabbed his coat and his rifle. I am going out the front door. I will draw their shots toward the rocks. You need to get out the back window. Make a run for the old barn ruins. Hide yourself in the hay. Jeremiah, they will kill you. Go. He gave her a shove toward the back of the house. Jeremiah kicked the front door wide open and threw himself out, rolling into the snow. He fired 3 quick shots. Bang, bang, bang! One of the riders fell from his horse immediately. He is out! Get him! Lillian squeezed through the small window in the back, tearing her dress as she tumbled into the freezing mud behind the sod house. She could hear the men shouting, the pounding of horse hooves, and the deafening reports of gunfire. She did not run for the barn. Instead, she ran to the corner of the house. She could see Jeremiah taking cover behind the water barrel, pinned down by 3 riders who were circling him. A 4th man had gotten off his horse and was walking toward the burning doorway with a torch, ready to finish what he started. Lillian raised her Winchester rifle. She remembered her training. Breathe out. She aimed, not at the men on horseback, but at the man on the ground holding the torch. Crack! The bullet hit the man squarely in the leg. He let out a scream and dropped the torch into the snow. The riders twisted in their saddles, confused by where the shot had come from. We are being flanked. He has got help. Jeremiah took advantage of the confusion. He stood up, completely exposed, and fired with deadly accuracy. One rider toppled over. Another rider's horse panicked and threw him off. The last 2 men, finally understanding this was not going to be an easy kill, lost their nerve. They pulled on their reins, turned their horses around, and galloped back down the valley into the blackness of the storm. Lillian? Jeremiah's voice was hoarse and weak. She rushed to his side. He was slumped against the water barrel, holding his left side. Blood was soaking through his fingers, dark red and steaming in the frigid air. I am right here, she cried, falling to her knees beside him. Oh, dear God, you have been shot. It is just a scratch, he lied, his teeth clenched in pain. His face was a sickly gray color. Help me. Get me to the barn, to the bunker. The house was now completely on fire, the flames leaping and roaring into the dark night sky. It was like a giant signal fire. Anyone for miles around in the valley would see it burning. They would all assume that Jeremiah Holt was dead. Lillian put his arm over her shoulder. She was much smaller than he was, but terror gave her an incredible strength. She pulled him across the snow-covered yard, through the busted-down barn door and over to the trap door. Getting him down the ladder was a terrible ordeal. He slipped about halfway down, crying out in pain, and landed with a hard thud on the floor of the bunker. Lillian secured the trapdoor above their heads, turning the iron locking wheel until she heard it click into place. The sounds of the roaring fire and the howling wind disappeared, replaced by the quiet, humming silence of the underground room. She hurried to his side and tore his coat open. The bullet had hit him in the side, just above his hip. It was not a fatal wound, but he had lost a dangerous amount of blood. The first aid kit, Jeremiah gasped, pointing a shaky finger at a metal box on the wall. Whiskey is in the desk. For the next hour, Lillian Hart was no longer a dressmaker. She was a battlefield surgeon. She cleaned the wound and stitched the torn skin with the same steady hands she used for her needlework, her old skills now serving a grim new purpose. She wrapped the wound tightly. Jeremiah lost consciousness from the pain about halfway through the process. When he finally fell into a deep, feverish sleep, Lillian washed the blood from her hands in a bowl of cold water. She looked around the bunker. Her home was gone, burned to the ground. They were now stuck underground. Sterling would believe they were dead, at least for a couple of days. She walked over to the telegraph machine that sat in the corner of the room. Jeremiah had spoken a name, Dutch Van Doren. She had no idea how to use the code. She did not know any of the procedures, but she noticed a small notebook lying next to the machine with the word cipher written on the cover. She opened it. It was filled with complicated letter and number codes. But on the very last page, there was a simple note. Emergency contact. Laram Freight. Lillian sat down in the chair. She had never touched a telegraph key in her life, but she recognized the rhythm of Morse code from pictures in the newspapers. ... She started to tap the key. Her movements were awkward and slow. SOSBLACKWATER. She stopped and listened. There was only silence. She began tapping out the message again, and then again. For an entire hour, she sat there in the dim light, sending her desperate message out into the empty air. And then the machine clicked. The paper tape started to move. RECEIVEDWHOISTHIS. Lillian stared at the words printed on the paper. She tapped her reply, HISWIFE. There was a short pause. Then the machine began to chatter back furiously. Hold fast. Dutch is rolling. Lillian fell back into the chair, exhausted. She looked over at Jeremiah sleeping on the cot. Rest now, husband, she whispered. Help is on the way. 2 days went by in the dark, underground space. While Jeremiah battled a fever from his gunshot wound, Lillian transformed into the planner. Going through the ledgers in the bunker, she pieced together the shocking truth. Jeremiah was not just collecting water rights. Under the business name J.H. Holdings, he had been quietly purchasing Union Pacific stock for many years. He was not hiding from the world. He was biding his time. He now held enough power to compel the railroad to build through their valley, the southern route, which would make Caleb Sterling's land investments to the north completely worthless. Sterling was not just a greedy man. He was in debt up to his eyeballs and was terrified of going bankrupt. You are backing him into a corner, Lillian said out loud, looking at the geological maps. If the railroad board members see these surveys, they will have to choose your route. Sterling will be wiped out. That is the plan, Jeremiah rasped from his cot. But he is a desperate man. He will burn this whole valley to the ground to find these maps. Just then, 3 clear knocks sounded on the hatch above. It was not Sterling. It was their backup. Dutch Van Doren came down the ladder with 2 men behind him carrying a large crate. Inside was a carriage-mounted Gatling gun. Sterling thinks you are dead, Dutch grunted as he shook Jeremiah's hand. The whole town is celebrating it too. Let them, Lillian said, her voice now hard as steel. We have to get these original survey maps to the railhead before the supply train pulls out tonight. It is the only way to settle this by the book. The roads are being watched, Dutch warned. We will never make it through with a wagon. Then we will take the river, Lillian countered. The rapids are rough, but nobody will be on them. It is the one path he will not be guarding. Jeremiah tried to get to his feet, grimacing as his wound protested. I am going. You can barely walk, much less row a boat, Lillian told him firmly. She wrapped the maps in a waterproof oilskin and strapped the entire tube to her back. I will take the skiff. I will get this proof to the conductor. Dutch, you are with me. Jeremiah, can you hold down the bunker? Jeremiah looked at the brand-new Gatling gun, then at his wife. She was no longer a frightened seamstress, but a field general. "I can hold the line," he said. "Go." They pulled the heavy logging skiff into the freezing, churning waters of the Blackwater River. As Lillian and Dutch shoved off into the wild current, the first thunderous roar of the Gatling gun echoed from the ridge they had just left. Jeremiah was drawing all the enemy's attention. Now Lillian had to conquer the river to strike the final blow to Sterling's entire empire. The journey down the river was a frantic nightmare of icy water and sheer terror. Dutch expertly guided the skiff through the dangerous rapids, running it aground just as the Union Pacific No. 119 started to move away from the station. Lillian did not waste a second. Soaking wet and shivering from the cold, she scrambled aboard the moving locomotive and thrust the oilskin tube into the hands of the surprised conductor. "Get these to the board in Cheyenne tonight," she yelled over the shriek of the steam whistle. "It will save the company millions." The train chugged eastward, carrying the very evidence that would bring Sterling to his knees. Back on the ridge, Jeremiah was down to his very last bullet. Sterling's men had the bunker completely surrounded. Just as Sterling gave the order for the final charge, the ground began to shake, not from dynamite, but from the thunder of horse hooves. Lillian had returned, and she was leading a squad of United States Marshals. "It is over, Caleb," Lillian called out, sliding down from her horse. "The board voted an hour ago. They picked the southern route. Your land is worthless, and the bank is calling in all your loans." Sterling, seeing that his whole world had just crumbled to dust, raised his cane gun in a final, desperate act of rage. A shot from a marshal shattered it in his hand. As they hauled him away in chains, screaming about a kingdom that was no longer his, Jeremiah stumbled out of the bunker, covered in blood, but alive. Lillian ran and caught him, and right there, among the ruins of the war they had just won, Jeremiah finally slipped the heavy gold ring onto her finger. 3 years later, the little sod hut was gone. In its place stood a grand white timber mansion that looked out over a bustling new rail town. Lillian Hart had journeyed west, expecting a life of hardship, but instead she found a true partner, a great fortune, and a battle that was worth fighting. She had not just married a simple farmer. She had helped build an entire empire. Lillian Hart proved that out in the Wild West, the most powerful weapon was not a six-shooter. It was a woman with a good plan. She saved her husband, she ruined a tyrant, and she built a legacy that would go on forever. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and romance on the American frontier, please give us a like and subscribe to the channel. Did you ever think Lillian would be the one to save the day? Tell me what you think down in the comments. Thanks for listening. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.